You see consumers moving away from companies that are creating social or environmental harm. You see young people refusing to work for companies that are polluting. If we simply concentrate on making money without giving regard to the social and environmental consequences, then we get the environmental consequences we're all familiar with and the huge social gaps that we see. And financial markets began to realize this. I'm totally a believer in systemic change, and impact accounting gives you the ability to push impact measurement and valuation all the way down the supply chain, affecting the whole economy of every country. In order to improve the world, the answer has to be systemic impact.
Hello, Sir Ronald. A pleasure to see you again. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Pleasure to see you, Javier, again.
Sir Ronald, we're celebrating our fifth anniversary at Ship2B Ventures and 12 years on the Ship2B journey. And many things are happening in the world and in the impact space. And we wanted to have a touch point with you to see how you see things in the present moment. I like to say, Sir Ronald, that you've been like our Pope of Rome in these 12 years, and our reference. We've been touching base with you several times, and you've come to some of our impact forums, and you've been an inspiration during our whole journey. So thank you, Sir Ronald, to have you again. And I see you with a very good shape, and that you keep very young.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sir Ronald, let's start strong. We see a world that is very moved at the moment with Ukraine, Gaza, Trump, Putin, Xi, the far right, artificial intelligence, robots. So, what? How can we locate impact investing in what is happening in the world?
So I think we have to look at the world as being in a period of great transition. Obviously, we see geopolitical transition. It's obvious to everyone that the hegemonic uh, power of the United States has waned relative to China, and we're moving to at least a bipolar world. There are other connotations to the word bipolar. I hope they will not be um, appropriate. Um, at the same time, we're seeing transitions politically within countries under the influence of social media and the huge economic gaps that have arisen as a result of rising prosperity from the tech revolution and the fact that half population of most countries has been left behind, and so we're seeing a shift to less democratic regimes, and I think we can see a shift in the direction of impact in our whole economies as a response, in part to these transitions, and it's being accentuated by the transition to AI-powered economies now that are going to disrupt the labor markets of all our countries in the same way that the microchip 50 years ago began to disrupt all markets. Why do I say that our economic system is transitioning? Well, it's transitioning because it's shifting away from optimizing risk and return to optimizing risk, return, and impact out of necessity. Because if we simply concentrate on making money, without giving regard to the social and environmental consequences that we create in the process, then we get the environmental consequences we're all familiar with and the huge social gaps that we see. And financial markets began to realize this ahead of governments and philanthropists. We saw at the time of the G8 task force on social impact investment, which I chaired in 2014-15, 10 years ago, that ESG investing had got to 13 trillion. Well, it rose to 40 trillion before the charges of greenwashing arose. And these charges were heavily based on the fact that there was no real measurement of impact being created. So, impact investment is transitioning with capital flows that have been increasing to measuring impact. And now we have the arrival of impact accounting, which I'm very pleased to say has been brought by an organization I chair called the International Foundation for Valuing Impact. So basically, these huge transitions in the political and technology areas are being matched by a transition of our economic system to bring outcomes to the center of our consciousness and the center of our economic system. Because it's the only way that we can manage to overcome the challenges we face environmentally and socially. We can't overcome them by tinkering around the system anymore. The consequences are just too great. We have to get our whole economies to generate solutions to these big challenges. And the way to do that is to get our economies to optimize risk, return, and impact, or to become impact economies, as I call them in my book. So it's very relevant to the question you've just asked me.
And Sir Ronald, mm, 10 years ago, you used to say, well, there was an institution that was called the United Nations. It's an institution that I don't know what weight at the present moment has, but we had an agenda of sustainable development goals. And you used to say at that time that if impact investing was able to mobilize 30 trillion, we could be able to solve the sustainable development goals, no? And by 2030. And does this really still make sense? Does the United Nations still make sense? Is now another game? We have another game in the table. So, what are your thoughts on that?
If you look at what's happened, we've had the rise of ESG. And if you bring measurement to ESG, you turn it into impact investment. So by bringing impact accounting into being now, we have the potential to drive $40 trillion into companies that are achieving environmental or social benefits, doing good and doing well at the same time, as we like to call it. Very interestingly, 10 years ago, we talked about the social impact bond, right? The social impact bond has inspired nearly $1 trillion market, trillion, in sustainability linked bonds and loans, where the interest the company pays, like Iberdrola, falls if it achieves certain targeted environmental or social outcomes. I think what we see now is that the tools are there to be able to turn the financial markets into creators of positive impact as well as creators of profit. And the reason it's even more evident now is that despite the pushback politically, you see consumers voting with their purses. You see them moving away from companies that are creating social or environmental harm. They don't want to buy the products of these companies. You see young people refusing to work for companies that are polluting. They want to work for companies that are, creating a good. And you still see investors realizing that these changes in consumer preferences come with taxation that governments are imposing on bad impact. So we now have 25 countries levying carbon taxes across the world. And so it's become even more obvious now that companies and investors have to look through the Trump administration, which is really the status quo, fighting back against this transition to impact economies, and saying we have to future proof ourselves. We have to create resilience within our companies to cope with this changed environment. And it actually makes it easier to grow a company more profitably if you optimize risk return impact than if you simply optimize risk return.
And Sir Ronald, getting into this, there has clearly been a part of the world that has been opposing ESG. ESG has been even criminalized, and some of the major financial players are pulling back. And you're saying, Sir Ronald, that maybe impact accounting is the solution, or impact measurement and impact accounting is the solution. But how serious is the political and market backlash against impact in the last years? And do you think that this impact measurement and impact accounting is really going to be a turning point for the market?
Well, let me answer in two parts. The first part is the backlash today is of a political nature. It's based on climate denial and the pushback on defining the role of companies socially as well as financially, right? It's a political pushback. Does it solve the major issues we face, the environmental issues and the social gaps which are threatening the cohesion of democracies? The answer is no. However, there are some aspects of the impact story that are relevant even to that pushback. So even administrations that are like the Trump administration in their beliefs are worried about the cost effectiveness of government spending. Government is the biggest funder of efforts to tackle social issues, right? If they begin to measure outcomes instead of just measuring budgets of money to be spent in trying to achieve outcomes that are not measured, the evidence is it costs half as much as normal commissioning. And so I had an article published in the Financial Times just a few days ago on Monday, which basically said cash strapped governments have to use impact investment and outcomes partnerships now if they want to maintain their social agendas in place. Now, that's the first part of my answer. The second part of my answer is if you think in terms of a transition to impact economies, the three milestones we're passing on the way to impact economies are the measurement of outcomes through outcomes partnerships, which are social impact bonds, of which there are 300 across the world, tackling um, issues in 8 different policy areas in 40 countries. So that's made its way. But the sustainability linked bonds and loans capital pool of nearly $1 trillion, which I mentioned, green bonds, sustainability bonds, which are becoming increasingly focused on measuring their impact. And so the first bit of it is actually outcomes based partnerships that bring stakeholders together, investors, governments, delivery organizations, to tackle social and environmental issues. The second one is the flow of capital, impact capital, that measures its outcomes. So we've seen an increase in metrics, tons of carbon, cubic meters of water, square kilometers of eroded soil. Um, that data has increased hugely now. And to the extent that companies are beginning to measure in quantity terms their metrics, that is the milestone we're currently at. The third milestone is to bring these metrics into financial analysis by giving them a monetary value. And that's impact accounting, which is created by providing databases of values for different impacts, which you can marry with the metrics, so the tons of carbon and the cubic meters of water. And a year ago, IFVI, the International Foundation for Valuing Impacts, which, as I said, I chair, published 100,000 value factors for environmental impacts across nearly 300 locations in the globe. My hope is that you will see these on the terminals of the big data providers very soon, in a matter of months before the end of next year. And that will enable investors to assess the risks to companies that come from their impact performance. So, in terms of taxation, in terms of changing consumer preferences, in terms of changing talent preferences. And investors, when they have this financial information, will begin to analyze companies on the basis of how far they are decoupling their profit generation from negative impact generation. So if a company is growing both negative impacts and sales and profits, clearly it has not decoupled. If, on the other hand, the profits are going up and the emissions, for example, are going down, then you know that companies' prospects are going to be improving. And if there are carbon taxes, for example, that are introduced, it's going to fare better than companies that are boosting their emissions as they boost their growth. So, a new way of thinking is going to come out of impact accounting and impact measurement in the same way that a new way of thinking came out of the measurement of risk, which revolutionized investment portfolios in my lifetime.
But Sir Ronald, for this new way of thinking, well, we're now going through a new way of thinking with the president of the US saying that climate change doesn't exist, or saying that if the pregnant woman take Tylenol, they will have children with autism. And so, mm, is this really? I mean, what you say is a rational scenario. But what we're seeing now is that mm, there are many people there just talking and saying things, and truth seems to disappear, and objectivity and rationality seems to evaporate in the current world. No, what do you think is going to happen with this? Because it's quite amazing what we're seeing and what we're listening lately in the
Right.
news.
But rationality in thinking does not disappear from the investment world. And rationality in thinking does not disappear from the business world either. There may be negative incentives that the Trump administration and others try to bring in. But in the same way that judging the Earth to be flat didn't make it flat, denying the existence of climate isn't going to make climate go away. Climate's going to continue to worsen through the years of the Trump administration. They won't ascribe it to climate alone. They will find other reasons for it, but it is going to continue to worsen. So, if you ask me, is the world going to buy the Trump administration's argument? The answer is no. The world is going to be compelled to compromise with it because there may be sanctions associated, uh, with going in an opposite direction. But the world is going to continue to prepare for dealing with environmental issues and social issues, because otherwise competitors will begin to take advantage of the opportunity offered. And Tesla is the first company to have done so. So it created $1 trillion value by bringing environmental considerations into the automobile industry. If Tesla had simply had a better designed combustion engine car, it would never have done that, right?
And there's Sir Ronald talking about Tesla. What are we not understanding of Elon Musk? Because I remember 10 years ago, we used to see him as one of the impact heroes. And he has made such strange moves in the last 10 years that some days I tend to think that I'm not understanding something or I'm missing something. What is happening there, Sirona? Because it's not only about Elon Musk. You see it also in many different people. These contradictions that they seem at one side that they're doing the right thing, but then and the impact washing has been a bit of this. No, we see here also many corporates in Spain that you never know whether they are really implicated with their social mission or they're doing impact washing, and it's kind of a gray area, no? So how do we deal with that type
So,
with this type of people and this type of corporations, no?
so human beings are complex beings with complex minds and complex emotions, and they're full of contradictions. But you don't hear Elon Musk denying climate. You don't hear Elon Musk saying we mustn't worry about emissions. You do see Elon Musk saying the role of government should be as small as possible. The role of business should be only to make money. And that's the best way for humanity to progress. Survival of the fittest is, the most appropriate rule, in his view, for humanity to progress. Okay, so there are contradictions. And it's unfortunate that in the case of Tesla, his other views have affected the prospects of Tesla itself, because you see consumers now in Europe reducing their purchases of Tesla vehicles by 40 or 50%. But it's interesting because we were talking of geopolitical, but there's also geoeconomic trends. It's interesting that China has cut the bullshit, if you forgive my language, and said environmental is going to be big business. We want to dominate the solar panel business. We want to dominate the electric vehicle business. In fact, we want to dominate the clean energy world. The world isn't painted one color with the same brush. There are many competing influences. And if you ask me today, as an investor, which, as you know, is my profession as a venture capitalist and a private equity investor, would I invest in companies making decisions that ignore impact? I would say you must be crazy. In fact, the private equity industry is the area where impact measurement and specialist funds have continued to proliferate, as you know, because you're raising funds yourself at the moment, the venture capital and private equity industry. There are more than 25 impact funds with $1 billion or more of capital. There are more than 100 venture capital and private equity impact funds. So the people who are looking further ahead are putting their bets on these environmental trends continuing and having to get their companies in a shape to cope with increased taxation, changes in consumer preferences, and talent preferences.
And Sir Ronald, just now looking a bit back from 25 years ago when you started impact investing in London, um, what would you say have been the biggest achievements of impact investing, and what would you say have been the major unfinished tasks or failures?
When we wrote in 2014, The Invisible Heart of Market, which was the report of the G8 Social Impact Investment Task Force, we had a chapter entitled The First Trillion. We defined impact investment as investment which not only had the intention, like ESG, to create positive impact, but also measured the impact created. Well, we're at 2 trillion today, right? We saw ESG treble in the decade that followed the publication of this report. We recommended then that we needed to move to impact accounting. Well, impact accounting is here. And so, if you ask me, looking back to 2015, looking back a decade, has the idea of an impact paradigm shift advanced? The answer is yes. There's no doubt that it has advanced. If you ask me what surprised you going back 10 and 25 years, it surprised me that financial markets understood it while governments and philanthropists didn't. Very few philanthropists understood it. The Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, to a degree, the Rockefeller Foundation, a few foundations around the world understood it, but philanthropy didn't. And governments didn't understand what it could do for them. They will eventually have outcomes budgets instead of just having financial budgets for expenditure, right? They'll have outcomes budgets and they will distribute money according to how the money is going to create the best outcomes in different areas. So if you think back to when I started out as a venture capitalist, I launched out in 72 with the intention to become a venture capitalist. My first fund in Europe was in 81. Incidentally, it was a £10 million fund, the biggest in Europe at the time. The latest Apex fund is $13 billion, private equity rather than venture capital, but $13 billion. The measurement of risk came in the 50s at the University of Chicago. And when I was sitting on the benches of Harvard Business School thinking about becoming a venture capitalist in 1969, I didn't appreciate that the measurement of risk was creating the opportunity for me. Now, why do I say that? In my day, in 69, investors invested in bonds and stocks of their own country. 70-30, 70 equity, 30 bonds, right? The measurement of risk brought the concept of impact weighted return. If venture capital is riskier but delivers an oversized return, then maybe there's a place for it in a portfolio. Maybe you're better off having it than not having it because the return is much greater than the risk you've added. And that concept brought diversification. Fine, you want to include it, but how much of it do you include, given the other investment opportunities you have? And so we shifted to multi asset portfolios with venture capital, private equity, hedge funds, property, stocks, bonds, etc. And in that sense, the measurement of risk opened the door to the tech revolution. Later, when emerging markets came on the scene, people said the same thing that they said about venture capital: it's too risky. And again, the wise investors said, sure, it's riskier, but how much more profitable is it? And you began to see investment in emerging markets and globalization. So the measurement of risk opened the door to the tech revolution and globalization and to my successful career in a new area that had not existed and which could not have existed if you hadn't had the notion of risk adjusted return in mind, the area of venture capital and then private equity. It led, therefore, to a shift in portfolios. Technology brought another shift. Technology increased the level of risk for those who were investing in it and for those who were not investing in it. When I started out, it would have been hard to imagine the cellular phone, although by the 80s, people were talking of cellular, very early, end of 70s, beginning of the 80s, of cellular phones being everywhere, to envisage the internet and to envisage that the combination of these technologies would transform retailing. People were saying in the early 80s, the chip is going to transform the computer industry. They weren't saying it's going to transform the world. And so you had a rotation within portfolios of companies that were adopting technology or creating technology versus those that were denying the risk of it affecting their business. The same has already begun to happen with impact. Like you think in terms of investment in coal mines, there are very few people around who are prepared to bet on coal mines as a profitable investment for more than a very short period of time ahead of us, right? The reason is because of its terrible environmental effects, right? And we're going to see now another shift in portfolios, and it's going to be enhanced by AI because where impact meets AI is where we're going to see the biggest growth and the biggest profit. What I'm saying, Javier, is the pushback of the Trump administration is a down cycle in a trend that is continuing to go in the direction of improving the environment and improving society.
Okay, and Sir Ronald, after these 2 decades of deals and exits and funds, um, have we really created a credible track record proving that impact investing can deliver both return and measurable impacts at scale? Or are we still in the journey and it's not that clear yet? We've had 20, 25 years of a track record. It's still an emerging market, it's still an emerging asset class, but what can we say about the track record of impact investing?
So we have to distinguish the cycle from the trend here too. We saw a period where ESG funds outperformed non ESG funds. And then the political cycle changed, and they became less fashionable, and the price of oil shot up, improving the profitability of fossil fuel related companies. Um, but it's cyclical. If you say to me, is the trend to increasing consumption of fossil fuel relative to clean energy? The answer is no. And if you don't see that trend, then you're missing a very important factor. For goodness sake, even the big fossil fuel producers like Saudi Arabia are moving into solar in a big way because it's cheaper and as well as cleaner. To answer your question, you can point to specific companies that have combined risk return impact and the competitive advantages that they have derived from doing so versus competitors who have not. And that is the evidence you need to continue investing because it takes time for these changes to work their way through. For the Tesla to grow into $1 trillion company took 2 decades, two and a half decades. But I invest venture capital only in seed and A and B and C rounds. I mean, if the companies are successful, I'll go all the way to a Z round. But I invest only in ventures that have positive impact. And what I see is they gain a competitive advantage. For example, you might have a software company like Optibus, which is working in the area of software for public transport. In the old days, it would measure sales growth and profits. Optibus measures carbon emissions and adapts the size of vehicle to the demand at different times of day, as well as optimizing the routes. It measures commuter time, which hits more vulnerable communities. It measures number of hours worked by the driver, and it measures number of accidents caused. When Optibus is competing for a contract, it gives it a competitive advantage. And you see that happening in the market. So I think the shoots are there in companies that are going to grow to become some of them the Microsofts and the Apples of the impact revolution.
I'm interested in knowing from your side, what do you think are the countries and the financial groups that you see leading the movement? And especially also, what do you think are the biggest gaps in evidence that still hold institutional investors for committing trillions to impact? So what are the gaps, and who is leading the movement, and what are the gaps to move from billions to trillions?
So, first of all, there's the thought leadership. And now you have a variety of organizations that, like GSG Impact, like the International Foundation for Valuing Impact, like Social Finance, like Bridges Ventures, like Better Society Capital, just to name those that I have been involved with, Ship2B, which are actually practicing these ideas and implementing and showing how this can be implemented. Then you have corporations and investor group, which realize that this is the future. So on the corporate side, companies like Novartis, like NL, like Iberdrola have, SI in Japan, BASF and others have all gone in the direction, Michelin, have all gone in the direction of measuring and sometimes valuing impact. Danone under Manuel Faber did the same. in the direction of valuing impact in order to get their product portfolio in line with environmental and social priorities that are important to consumers. Among investor groups, BlackRock has been the big name, but there are other companies, LGT, Liechtenstein Gresham Trust, was emerged from the merger of these two organizations, Schroders, Wellington, um, Bridgewater, uh, very eminent um, asset management groups uh, are applying this type of thinking in portfolio construction. What do you need for this to become mainstream? You need measurement. You can't manage what you don't measure. You need
And
measurement,
and with
and that's why.
measurement, Sir Ronald, with measurement, you talked about impact measurement and impact accounting. You were pioneer with the idea of impact weighted accounting. When is this really going to happen? When will this, for instance, in Spain, when will we have social impact weighted accounting instead of the current normal accounting that we have right now with the companies?
So I think in the year ahead, you will see companies using the information that will appear hopefully on the data provider screens to create impact statements that show their sales, their profits, and their different impacts in monetary terms. You will find analysts calculating the PE ratio of a company on an impact weighted basis. It'll happen. Now, how long will it take for a sufficient number of investors and companies to be using this so that regulators step in and say, now we have to mandate this so that it is published according to the same standard with auditing and so on as financial reports. I think, 5 years maybe. I don't think we're talking 15, 20 years. The political dimension is a factor because the Trump administration undid all the work of the Biden administration in bringing environmental transparency, on companies' impacts. So gap accounting took a while to take off. It was introduced in 33. Probably a decade later, it began to be implemented at some scale, and another decade, and the whole world was doing it.
One on a growing trend in impact investing. There are many actors that have been deceived by results of individual impacts, and they're moving towards systemic impact, collective impact. There's a new trend going on there. What do you think about it?
I'm totally a believer in systemic change. And impact accounting gives you the ability to push impact measurement and valuation all the way down the supply chain, affecting the whole economy of every country if it goes to scale. So if the answer is should we be looking at individualistic impact by a company or thinking in terms of systemic impact in order to improve the world, the answer has to be systemic impact.
Okay. And Sir Ronald, you said before that you were a bit deceived by how philanthropy and government is moving in the impact space. Uh, we've had the example of social impact bonds. We also have the example of the blended finance and many other innovations that we're seeing in the impact space. In all those innovations, you clearly need philanthropy and governments blending in some way with private investors. Uh, do you think this will really take over and this take off? and
So,
we
so the
need to
fact,
grow the space.
yes, I do. The fact that you have cash-strapped governments now has led the UK government to announce a billion-pound fund, 500 million from central government, and hopefully another 500 million from local authorities and maybe philanthropists to address children's issues in the UK. It's the first time we have a government establishing a £1 billion outcomes fund. I am pushing the government to extend from just children's issues to issues like homelessness, recidivism, training and upskilling of people whose jobs are threatened by AI, um, and, uh, and so on. I think the fact that governments are cash strapped and that these outcomes partnerships uh, where payment is made when outcomes have been achieved, and capital is attracted from investors with the discipline they bring to delivery organizations that can achieve these impacts. I think that's the way of the future. I think if you look ahead 20 years, every government will have a big chunk of outcomes based commissioning.
You also mentioned about artificial intelligence and the crossing with impact investing.
Yes.
So, what do you think is going to happen there, and how are they going to be influenced both trends, and how can they work together? Is there something you can say there?
Yes, I'll give you one example. So, education is being transformed by artificial intelligence already. I invested in a company called Master School, which is training people remotely, giving them degrees remotely now. You can have customized learning. I'm shifting away from the master school example of 1 million people simultaneously now. You could never do that before. So, in areas like education, AI is going to have a massive effect. In areas like health, similarly, whether it's in research or whether it's in diagnosis or whether it's in the analysis of data or companies I've invested in, whether it's in preparing claims by hospitals to insurance companies on behalf of their patients through artificial intelligence. It's going to be a massive addition, and where impact and AI meet is going to be the area where I think you're going to see the greatest financial value created for companies.
Okay. Sir Ronald, last question but not least. Um, when we meet each other in 2035, what would be like two or three key KPIs that you think would be a success for the impact movement? So, what do you think we need to see in 10 years that would clearly be a sign that we've been successful with the impact movement?
Companies publishing audited impact statements that show their revenues, their costs, and their different impacts. Um, uh, Funds that are focusing on delivering profits and impact at the same time in the way that ESG tried to do, but showing the values of the impacts that have been created. Um, Investors who are allocating money in their portfolios introducing an impact dimension in their decision making right across their whole portfolios.
Okay, so let's hope this will happen. Thank you very much, Sir Ronald. It's a pleasure, a honor, and you continue to be a big inspiration for us. And hope to see you in 10 years in the same interview and having all these successes in with us. Thank you very much, Sir Ronald.
Onwards and upwards, Javier.
Thank
Good
you.
luck to you and congratulations on your anniversary.
Thank you very much, Sir Ronald. Pleasure.
Bye bye.
Bye.